This video will look at virtual triggers in WilloWare's Consulting Toolkit. Virtual triggers is a dexterity development tool, so as such it's not really an end-user tool. The diagram here shows there's an overlap. Anything that you could do with virtual triggers, you could also do with the dexterity development environment, but not necessarily the other way around. Virtual triggers has kind of a small set of things that it's capable of. The purpose of it is to allow easily adding small tweaks to GP behavior functionality. It cannot create new windows, it can't add new fields, it cannot have its own tables, so it's really limited to something really small. We do something on this particular window, when we click this button we want something else to happen. Something kind of along those lines. We'll look at a number of examples of actual virtual triggers that we've created for customers a little bit later in this demo. Some of the benefits of using virtual triggers is that once you've installed Consulting Toolkit, you have virtual triggers installed, then adding scriptlets, or these little bits of tweaks to GP functionality, adding scriptlets is really easy to do. You just cut and paste some text into the setup window. It's easy to change the scriptlets, just tweak some of the text that's in the setup window, and then it's easy to enable or disable the scriptlets. So it allows you to make some changes to GP functionality. There's one situation where it is particularly beneficial to use virtual triggers, and that's when you have an environment where installing code, so installing a third-party product or installing a customization, if you have an environment where doing such installations is really difficult, virtual triggers can be pretty beneficial. So you might have a hosted environment where it's a pretty thorough process to get new code installed. You might have to send it to somebody and fill out some forms and get approval and schedule time, and there can be a long time lag there, and actually making that happen is kind of a challenging thing to do. Or maybe you are a 24-hour facility and actually scheduling downtime for the server is a very difficult thing to do. So in both those cases, once you get the product installed, then adding these scriptlets and making changes to scriptlets is really easy to do because it's all done from inside GP through the user interface in GP. Again, just to reiterate what I mentioned on the previous slide, the purpose of virtual triggers and what it's really good for are making really small tweaks to GP functionality. And again, we'll look at several examples of how it's been used. So this list here is shows a whole bunch of different situations that we've addressed with virtual triggers. Everything that occurs before the break in the list there will be virtual triggers that we're going to look at today. Everything below are just some other examples of things we've done. Auto-generate payables batch ID. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but in this case the customer had some particular logic that they wanted to use to generate a batch ID so that every batch ID was unique. With something like that, anytime you try to rely on users to manually enter it, it's really easy to make a mistake. So this scriptlet just automated that process. Set payables check date to the current date. The way that GP normally works in payables transaction entry is when you open up the check window, it sets the check date to the document date. This scriptlet sets the check date to the current date on the server. View batch note on a posted cash receipt. This one is kind of interesting. The cash receipt entry window has a batch field, and when you create a cash receipt batch, you can add a note to the batch. That's all viewable and editable while you are working with an open transaction, but once you've posted it, you can no longer get to that batch note. You can't In fact, there isn't a note button on the inquiry window, so you can't see that there was a note. And there is no way at all to get to it from inside of GP, but GP does retain that information. So once you've posted the batch is in history, the note is still there, but there's no way to view it. This scriptlet provides a way to get to the note. Open the Suggest Items window in Sales Transaction Entry for backordered items. This is another kind of interesting one. The Suggest Items window does not open for a backordered sales line quantity. This tweak gives you the ability to pop open the window if you've got a backordered quantity and select from a suggested item. Auto-calculate SOP trade discount. In this case, the client had some rules for which items would be included in the discount. That was based on a item class. If the total was below a certain amount, there was one trade discount, and if the total was above a certain amount, it had another trade discount. That was a pretty difficult thing for users to do because they had to look up the item class, figure out which items were in the correct class, add up the subtotal, and then make a decision about whether or not it's above or below the amount and calculate the correct amount. So it was pretty difficult for an end user to do that, and this scriptlet calculates it automatically. The last one we'll look at involves manufacturing. So everything above this, the first ones are all core GP, but I also wanted to show one that involves manufacturing, or involves non-core GP. Technically, manufacturing is a third-party product, so this is a example of using scriptlets in a third-party product, so something that isn't just core SOP pop inventory. And then there's a few more just to provide some additional examples of the types of things you can do with virtual triggers. Make inventory in a quality control bin invisible to sales order processing. In this case, they had inventory that wasn't approved yet to be sold, and they didn't want users to accidentally select the inventory for fulfillment, or for that matter for GP to automatically select it for fulfillment. So this scriptlet makes that inventory invisible, so it cannot be used in sales order processing. Allow user to edit their own SOP documents only. Normally you could get into any open unposted document to make changes to it. This one puts some restrictions in there so that users can only work with their own documents. Allow price increases only in sales order processing. Similar type of thing. Sales people could increase the price, but they can't decrease the price. Restrict user access to certain vendors. In this case, the client had a vendor that was used for payroll, and they didn't want users to be able to access that vendor. There were only certain users who could access the vendor. So they didn't want them to be able to pull up open transactions or look at them in inquiries. There were also a number of security changes and other system changes that were made beyond just using the scriptlets. But in this case, there were several scriptlets that were created to prevent users from getting into several of the windows in GP to view this one particular vendor. And then lastly, auto-generate GL batch ID. This is exactly the same idea as the payables batch ID, just applied to the journal entry window. So now we'll hop into GP and we'll look at virtual triggers in action. The virtual triggers setup window is located in System Utilities. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time digging into how exactly virtual triggers works. Again, it's a dexterity development tool, and you have to know a lot of dexterity, and so there's looking at what the window can do and how to use it would really be a dexterity class. So we'll go through these examples. We'll look at the virtual trigger setup window. There's just a couple little things in here we'll take a look at. We're not going to explore the scripting in too much detail. And then we'll flip over and take a look at what it's actually doing in GP. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the scriptlet that generates the payables batch ID. The name virtual triggers comes from comes from something you do in the dexterity development environment called creating a trigger. This right here is a little bit of dexterity code. Trigger register. In this case, we're calling it virtual triggers because it's not part of dexterity code. This is something we're just sort of creating on the fly. So at any rate, that's where virtual triggers comes from. Every scriptlet will have two components. There's two bits of the script that we send. One part is the trigger and the other part is the script. So this is the trigger view, and then in a second we'll click on script and take a look at the script view. The trigger is the event in GP that causes something to happen. So in this case, we have a virtual trigger on the vendor ID field on payables transaction entry. The trigger is technically what's called a focus change trigger, and we're going to execute it after what normally happens when you type something into the vendor ID field. So the nutshell of all this is that our virtual trigger is going to execute when information is typed into the vendor ID field and then the cursor leaves the field. So you type in the vendor ID and you press the tab button, for example, to move out of the field. That causes the change event to happen on that field, which triggers the code. So in this case, when that trigger fires, it's going to execute this script, and then the script contains the business logic for how we want to generate the batch ID. So let's run over to payables transaction entry. So you note that the batch ID field is empty. Vendor ID field is down here. When we select the vendor ID, it'll populate this field. That will cause the change script to happen. That causes the virtual trigger to fire, and it'll populate the batch ID. So I'll drag this down. And this will happen pretty quickly. As soon as I select this, you'll see that the batch ID populates, and it's going to work just like typing something into the field. So it's going to prompt us, do you want to add this batch ID? The logic that was used here is the year, the month, the day, so 17/06/21, and then it's also using the time, hour, minute, second. Say yes, we want to add that. And that's it. Then you continue on with creating the payables transaction. Okay, so the next one we'll take a look at is the virtual trigger, or the scriptlet as we call it. This is the scriptlet that sets the check date to the current date rather than the transaction date. So in this case, the trigger is the event of the trigger is when the payables transaction entry check window opens. So when that window opens up, that event causes the trigger to fire, which runs this script. In this case, the script is pretty easy. It's just going to set the check date on the window to the date on the server. So on this one, I'm going to inactivate it first, and we'll take a look at what the window normally does. Okay, so the document date on the transaction is 4/21/2017. When I enter the check amount and tab off, the check window will open, and you can see it sets the date 4/21/2017 to the document date. So now we'll go back to virtual triggers. We'll activate it, save it, refresh the triggers. And now you can see that it's set the date to the current date from the server rather than setting it to the document date. Next on our list is the receivables batch note. In this case, we're doing something a little bit different. So in the first two, the trigger was a event. Something happened in GP, a field changed or a window opened. In this case, the trigger is going to add a additional menu option to a window. You could kind of think of this as it's a trigger on the window opening up, but this is a special kind of trigger that adds an additional menu. In this case, the window where we're going to add this is the cash receipts inquiry window. The menu item that will show up on the additional menu is going to say Zoom batch note. And again, here's the script over here that's involved in locating that note and opening it up. All right, so we're in the cash receipts inquiry Zoom. Here's our additional menu option that was added with the virtual trigger. And when we select this, it goes out and locates the note and opens it up. All right, so here's the suggest items trigger. This is the one that we're going to add another additional menu. We're adding it to sales transaction entry. The additional menu will say suggest items. And there's not a whole lot involved with this one. We just need a little bit of code to open up the suggest items window. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that GP doesn't normally open the suggest items for back-ordered quantities, it works perfectly fine when you do that. So once we open it up, nothing else was involved in order to allow the user to select an item from the suggest items list. So let's jump over into sales transaction entry. So in this case, I know that I don't have any available inventory for 128 SDRAM. So we are going to get prompted for what we want to do with this shortage. In this case, we're going to back order all. And then we can come up to the additional window and view suggested items. In this case, it tells us that 128 SDRAM is the suggested item. We can select that and it puts it onto the window. The next one is the auto calculate trade discount. Again, this is another what's called a form trigger. A form trigger adds the additional menu, and we're adding an additional menu onto sales transaction entry. It's going to say recalculate trade discount, and then there's a whole bunch of business logic over here for how we want to calculate that trade discount. So we come up to additional, select recalculate trade discount. You can see down here it populates the trade discount and recalculates the document. The last virtual trigger that we're going to take a look at is one that works in the manufacturing edit MO status window. Manufacturing is actually a third-party product. It's a separate dictionary in the GP installation. So this is a good example of showing how virtual triggers can work with a third-party product. In this case, the client wanted the window to default with these boxes always marked so that they could just unmark the box that they wanted to view. So if they all start as marked and we just want to look at open, then all we need to do is unmark open. So I wanted to start this one by showing you how a scriptlet is added to the system. You'll see that we don't have one in here for edit mo status, so that one hasn't been created yet. What we'll do when we create a scriptlet for you is it's just a text file, just plain .txt file. It's got the trigger ID in it. That gets copied and pasted to the trigger ID field, description, and there's some additional information in here. So we'll just go through the process of creating this virtual trigger in GP. Mark it as active. The database list is the list of databases where we want the virtual trigger to be active. This is the actual database ID, so you need to know what that is from SQL. Then we copy and paste the trigger in. Click over to the script view. And copy and paste the script. Click Save, and then refresh triggers. Now, when we open the Edit mo status window, you'll see that these boxes are all marked. This is intentionally left, this was one that was not included in the scriptlet, so that's intentionally left as unmarked. To recap, virtual triggers is a component of WilloWare's consulting toolkit. It is a development utility for Dynamics GP. It is not a replacement for full-on customization. Its ideal usage is really small tweaks to GP. Something really small that happens when you do something else, when you change a field, when you open a window, something like that. One thing we didn't look at, a script that we have done before, was to add a additional menu option that executed a stored procedure. You might do this if there is a whole bunch of SQL processing that needs to occur. It's easier to write that as a SQL stored procedure, but you need the ability to run it from inside GP. Perhaps an end user needs to be able to run it when something happens. So it's just another small example of the type of thing you could do with virtual triggers. Again, it's ideal for really quick small changes, and it's also ideal for environments where it's difficult to install new code. Once you get Consulting Toolkit installed, then that installation process is done. But as we saw when loading the edit mo status trigger, that's pretty easy to do. So once virtual triggers is there, creating new scriptlets is just a matter of cutting and pasting from a text file. It's all done through the user interface inside GP. If you'd like to learn more about this product or any of the other WilloWare software, please visit us at willowware.com or send us an email at sales@willowware.com.